Hey everyone, welcome to Tool Time's assessment of Operation Market Garden. Today we're going to be looking at 30 Corps and their performance. This video is an extension of some work I've done and some conversation I've had coming off of Tick History's channel. Lewis has some excellent work on Operation Market Garden, including an entire battlestorm sequence, some book reviews. He does an assessment and basically does a sort of a blame game to see where the operation failed and who was responsible for the decisions, etc. So he's got about half a dozen or so videos related to Market Garden that all paint a very good picture for someone who is, trying to understand this battle and trying to figure out where things went wrong. My video we're going to focus on one aspect of it today, and that's going to be pretty much the 30 Corps performance. We're going to talk about some of the myths around the operation. We're not going to delve too deeply into some of the other characteristics, but as we go forward, the channel that I'm looking to set up a channel. I'm not trying to compete with Tick or these guys. What he's doing on a full-time basis is well beyond what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to look at things and learn about the activities that happened. What were the leaders? What information did they have? What were their choices? What were their options? That sort of thing, and sort of understand the how the battle unfolded. And over time, I look to expand beyond Market Garden to other things. But unlike Tick, this is more of a hobby. This is not going to be paying any of my bills. So I do look to set up a channel that'll have my history stuff on it as sort of a hobby going forward. And these are some of the topics on the screen that I'm looking to cover before moving on to other activities. I love the American Civil War. A lot of recent work on reading on World War I as well as World War II, etc. And so who knows, down the road. But for today, we're going to focus on assessing 30 Corps. I'm going to go ahead and hide my ugly mug to save a little bit of bandwidth, and let's go ahead and get started. Now, one of the things that Lewis does a good job of articulating is that some of the narratives around Market Garden were formed fairly early on, mostly related to Cornelius Ryan's work with the A Bridge Too Far book and movie, which was obviously, both of those were excellent, but they had some definite narratives that time has shown may not be the full picture. And he goes into an extensive review in his Battlestorm series where he talks about the performance of 30 Corps. And generally speaking, I agree with him, and I think that as we go forward, probably the main distinction that I have with Lewis is probably that in order to evaluate 30 Corps, I think we need to look at them sort of in a before Nijmegen, at Nijmegen, and after Nijmegen context, because their performance is different in each of those phases. So I pick up here with a screenshot out of his one of his videos. I think this is the Arnhem by Anthony Beaver book review at 11:47. He talks about how 30 Corps here arrives at 9:30 on the morning of the day 3, which is the 19th, and that this is on time. And he stresses quite frequently that 30 Corps was not slow, was not behind. And in this, he and I are in absolute agreement. And so what we're going to do is proceed from that basis that the question will be, how do we evaluate them? For those who are naysayers, who think the 30 Corps was slow, how do we evaluate them? He shows them the timeline, but it's still somewhat subjective as to whether they're on time or not. At least in the videos that I've seen, nobody lays out the timeline according to the operations order, the synchronization matrix, if you will, and they just say, well, they should have been there quicker, right? So we're gonna try and develop a different way to look at this and a little more objective standards to look at this, and see whether or not Lewis is right in his assessment that 30 Corps was on time. Now, before we go any further, of course, most of us have seen the movie, and one of the I recall very vividly the expectations being set in two different parts of the movie, and I wanted to talk real quickly about what was expected of 30 Corps, because if you're going to condemn them for failing to do their job, it's like, what was their job? And so let's take a quick look at what the airborne, at least according to Ryan's book and the movie, what the airborne was thinking about the operation.
Well, Monsieur shows me that 30 Corps will do the 63 miles in 2 days.
Okay, so Browning is talking to his airborne commanders, and they're talking about 63 miles in 2 days. So let's ask our ground commander, what do you think about the situation?
64 miles behind enemy lines. Speed is the vital factor. The plan is to reach Eindhoven in 2 to 3 hours and Arnhem in 2 to 3 days.
Okay, so we start off the battle with everybody pretty much agreeing, right? It's 2 to 3 days. We're going to get to Arnhem. And, I don't know that it's important to talk about Eindhoven in 2 to 3 hours, but we'll come to that. Because this is going to be one of the major criticisms that sort of shadows and sets the tone for evaluating 30 Corps' performance. And it's a negative tone for a lot of people, especially those, if you will, from the American point of view. So real quick, I want to kind of give you sort of the upper and lower bounds here. Charles McDonald is a published author. He's probably a PhD. I don't know what his background is, but he wrote a book called A Mighty Endeavor. This was about the entire American effort in Europe, so it's not going to have a lot of time to talk about Operation Market Garden, but he does address it, and he addresses, the reason I'm using him is because he addresses it in a way that sort of picks up on and propagates the narratives of 30 Corps being, for lack of a better term, slow. So let's start with a couple of his quotes here and focus on a couple of key phrases. Only late on the 4th day, blah, blah, blah. He talks about the 4th day, and well, we're going to talk about the difference between hours and days and the significance of it and how timing sheds a negative light on 30 Corps' performance when you talk in terms of days as compared to when you talk in terms of hours. Page 346, he's talking about the overall operation might still have succeeded had the British ground column attacked with greater elan south of Eindhoven and north of the Wall. Well, clearly he's throwing some shade on 30 Corps here, but in fairness, he does spend about twice as much text in the remainder of his paragraph here, kind of hammering on the 82nd Airborne and their failures. So I don't think that he was unduly harsh on the British here, but he talks about this effort south of Eindhoven, and this is part of the perception. Because of a slow start, 30 Corps takes a historical rap for being slow when maybe not. So we'll talk about that some more. Now, so this is a scholar, right? This is a guy who wrote a book, and he paid $39 to get that book, right? Well, then you have the other end of the spectrum, the folks that I engage with on YouTube in some of the conversations, and one example is a guy named Big Woody, and he's one of these guys that's like, hey, it's all Monty's fault, right? And he has a fairly American-centric point of view, and I understand quite a bit of his concern, but let's take a look at that last sentence there. When the column made it a whole 7 miles on the first day, 11 hours behind schedule, and the numbers escalated, blah, 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 snail's pace going forward. One of the problems of evaluating any kind of military operation is, how do you evaluate it? Because if you sort of cherry pick the time and place, did they meet every metric on their timeline or their synchronization matrix, their execution matrix? You could probably bust every operation I've ever been a part of would have come up with some place where we were behind schedule at one point or another. The question really is, how did things turn out? Now you're going to say, well, they didn't turn out well, but we'll talk about that. And that's what I'm getting at is, before, at, and after Nijmegen, there's a different set of standards that we need to think about as we go forward. So today we're going to look at their performance, 30 Corps performance. I'm going to try and come up with what I think is an objective standard to evaluate them, not just, my opinion that they should have been somewhere by a certain amount of time. We're going to talk about the effects of words, of hours versus days in forming the legend, applying the context before, at, and after Nijmegen, and try and avoid the nationalistic blame game kind of thing. So let's take a look at the operation on a timeline here. Across the top, you can see the 17th of September all the way through day 5 of the 21st, and then, of course, the operation continues out until the extraction on the 26th. But this is the theory of how it really should have unfolded according to the book. Right? Well, when I say the book, to the timeline and the way it was portrayed in the movie Bridge Too Far, for example, which forms a lot of our impressions, a lot of people's impressions, let's say, in the performance of 30 Corps. So, of course, here's the airborne drops on midday or early afternoon on day 1, September 17th. They'll have follow-up drops the next day with the 82nd and 1st Airborne, and then, of course, the Polish going on day 3. And then the only two real benchmarks we have as viewers or as sort of casual readers is the 2 to 3 hours at Eindhoven, and then, of course, relieving them within 3 days or 72 hours here at 64 miles down the road, right? Now, before going any further, I do want to sort of step back, and I want to add a couple of thoughts here real quick. Let's put ourselves in Roy's Urquhart's shoes, British Airborne. I like to do my best to put myself in their shoes and look at what they knew, when they knew it, what the situations were before I make evaluations. And so before I go and condemn General Horrocks for being an utter failure because he didn't get there in 72 hours, I want to ask myself as the airborne guy, is this a realistic, is 72 hours realistic? And, I'm about to put my life, Roy, in the drop zone across 3 major river crossings, and it's either 6 or 7 other water obstacles. Am I going to, prepare myself so that if I'm not relieved exactly within 72 hours, that I'm going to be defeated, taken captured, or killed, and just vanish from the planet? I think that's an unrealistic expectation that any kind of major military operation is going to go exactly according to plan. So when you sort of set off, the claim is 2 to 3 days. Well, nothing happens in the Army in 2 days. Now remember, we're not talking about an army that's moving and the enemy is falling back in a rout and is on the roll, right? If the front was fluid and moving, yeah, maybe they could have done this in 2 days, right? 64 miles, 2 days. That's completely realistic, okay? But this isn't a moving fluid battlefield. Remember, the 30 Corps has been stationary, more or less stationary, on the Belgian border for about a week to 10 days or so prior to the initiation of this battle. And so it's going to, it takes time to get a military machine up and moving. And the Germans, however routed they may have been, have now had 7 to 10 days to rest, refit, repair, and dig in. Okay, so it's not like they're just going to roll down, no matter what anyone says about the nonsense about the road being open to Arnhem. The Germans had 88 millimeter guns. They had Panthers. They had Mark IVs, and potentially they had Tiger tanks. Even if they didn't have a lot of these things, they had 6 or 7 water obstacles. They had choke points at bridges. They had opportunities to blow bridges. They had superior tanks. They did not have any kind of air support, obviously. So, but to think that you're just going to roll up in 2 2 days, if you will, is probably not realistic. I'm gonna make a case for why I think that's true in a minute. So I'm gonna say 2 days is probably bullshit. Okay, so I'm gonna say 72 hours is our goal here. But if I'm Roy Urquhart, I'm not gonna be planning to just turn into a pumpkin at 1500 on the 20th of September simply because 30 Corps hasn't arrived. So I think it's important we understand that for planning purposes, Airborne should have really been anticipating any relief in the 72 to 96 hour window is really probably considered success. But we're going to hold 30 Corps to the 72 hours because that's what they said they were going to do. Okay. Now, there is one other thing we're going to touch on a little bit later, and that's the use of daylight hours and how this will have a dramatic impact in the perception of 30 Corps' conduct of their operation. It dramatically impacts how they proceed, especially in the early phase of the operation. We'll come back to that a little bit later. So, the important thing is, how do we evaluate it? Unless we have the synchronization matrix, and I don't have that, I'm not going to know exactly what times every little thing is supposed to happen. And I'm not really interested in trying to benchmark 30 Corps against a timeline that some staff officer put together based on their general opinions. I'm going to use something a little more, I hope, a little more objective. How far do they have to go, and how long did they have to do it? In the movie clips, they were Horrocks was doing his little briefing at a town called Leopoldsburg, which is about 83 miles behind. That's where his headquarters was. The town of Pelt is a little bit short of the front line of troops. Remember, not every single tank of 30 Corps is going to be up on the front line, right? So the center of mass, if you will, of 30 Corps is obviously going to be behind the lines. So Pelt is 72 miles from the bridge. And then, of course, the Belgian border, which represents the forward line of troops, more or less, is the magical 64 miles that they refer to. Now, for me, I'm going to keep it simple. I'm going to hold 30 Corps to a higher standard than the movie, right, or the border. I'm not going to say 64 miles. I'm going to say they got to go 72 miles, and they got 72 hours to do it, and that equals, according to my math, 1 mile per hour. Okay? Now, 1 mile per hour, remember, the leading troops that are up on the border that only have 64 miles to go, that means to get there in 72 hours, they can go even slower. But for our purposes, we're going to use the metric 1 mile per hour. Now, there's a difference between a theoretical rate of march and in reality. Obviously, things are going to happen more in the daytime than in nighttime, right? You're going to proceed at a much faster pace in the day than you will at night as a general rule. These are not FOB operations. This is not a forward operating base in Iraq or Afghanistan where half your guys are awake at night and half your guys are awake in the daytime and you're doing patrols in and out of the base. This is the entire 30 Corps operation, including all of its logistics and everything moving forward, progressively forward. The reality is you don't conduct 24-hour forward movement as a general rule. You move forward generally during the day, you secure a position, you rest and resupply at night, and you get ready and you do it again the next day. Okay? Can you find examples where they did meaningful forward operations during the daytime or during the nighttime during the course of World War II? Of course you can. But the reality is, when you're moving a whole formation, you got to rest it somewhere. You got to eat. You got to get water. You got to get refueled. You got to reload with ammo, and so that typically happens at night. So, in order to make that 72 miles, that average of 1 mile per hour, you're going to have to do better than 1 mile per hour during the course of the day because you're not going to be doing better at night. You're going to be doing virtually nothing in terms of forward progress at night. Now I'm going to smell test this by comparing this to Operation OIF, Operation Iraqi Freedom in 2003. Here you have a modern army fully mechanized. Everybody's motorized. You have air superiority. You have logistics, never imagined in the history of war. And the U.S. military, has to penetrate a forward defensive position, and then they move along a very long, narrow salient to an objective, in this case Baghdad, deep in the enemy rear. Okay. Now, they took them 21 days, 396 miles. That it worked out to be about 19 miles per day. Okay, so using my keep it simple stupid rule, we would be doing what? 1 mile per hour, so 24 miles per day. In the real world, over a much longer distance. So, just as a sanity check, 19 miles per day, that's not too bad. I mean, we're talking reasonable. So for those frontline troops that are sitting on the Belgian border that only have 64 miles to go, take 19 miles per day, that works out to relieving the airborne guys, or at least securing the bridge, 64 miles in at day 3.4. Somewhere in the 72 to 96 hour window that I mentioned earlier. So I think that for our purposes, we have a decent objective standard that we can now apply to this timeline. So here's the timeline. Let's take a look at what it looks like when we put 1 mile per hour. Okay, each of these yellow icons represents a bridge. The San Bridge, the Domel, the Vigel, and the A River, which are very close together. The Grave Bridge, the Maas Bridge, the Maas Canal, which had 4 options. The Domel had 4 options. Nijmegen, which has 2 options, and Arnhem, which has 2 options. The one that's in the book, or in the book and movie, and everyone knows, is of course the road bridge at Arnhem. Okay, now remember I said we're not going to operate at night. Well, okay, for the purposes of our timeline, we're going to assume an imaginary, rabbit is going 1 mile per hour all the way from the border, 64 miles, to Arnhem. When that rabbit gets to the San Bridge, 20 hours into it, this is where he's going to be. It happens, he's going to go all night, and he's going to continue on, and he's going to arrive here at Arnhem at, early hours of the 20th of September. Now, the main body of folks coming out of Pelt, the main body of the 30 Corps, we still have all the way out to 72 hours. So if we're running a little slow, as long as we relieve them by 72 hours, we've met our threshold. But the reality is, a tank starting right at the border, if he was to survive doing that 1 mile per hour, leg, he's going to arrive at Arnhem right about here with plenty of time to spare. Now, as we mentioned before, we're not really expecting this exact timeline because things don't happen at night the same way they do during the day. So what's the difference between my imaginary timeline and reality, right? Night. Okay, we're talking, as I said, we don't expect continuous progress at 1 mile per hour. We're going to move in spurts. We're going to run up the road, and we're going to grab a position, stay overnight, run up to the road the next day, grab a position, stay overnight. And what we're hoping for is that the average works out to be 1 mile per hour. Now, this is where I want to take a brief detour into the good plan, badly executed narrative and its credibility. If I understand right, Lewis tends to think that this is basically a good plan, that the good plan, badly executed narrative is out of date, and he kind of narrows it down. I'm going to make the case in a later video. This was never a good plan. This was a good strategic concept. This had good strategic objectives. Penetrating, cutting off the folks in the Scheldt, the Germans in the Scheldt estuary, or turning into the Ruhr, or whatever. That was a reasonable expectation or desire on the part of Schaeff Command and Eisenhower and above. Absolutely good concept. The plan itself was bad. Period. The end. And it was badly executed. Now, with that said, a bad plan, boldly executed, is sometimes better than no plan at all. just because it was a bad plan and just because it was badly executed. If it was boldly executed, it might still have succeeded, and it nearly did. But let's take a quick look at what I mean by a bad plan. And just one element of how we could have taken this plan and made it better, and in the process given 30 Corps and the whole operation a better chance. Now, some people are going to say, well, this is revisionism, this is what-ifism. Okay, look, the way I try and analyze things is put yourself in the shoes of the people at the time. Okay, now if you're the ground force commander, it's always best to have the whole day to get stuff going, right? And for those who are going to say, well, if we move the kickoff time from 3 o'clock in the afternoon for the ground forces back to the beginning of this day here, well, that'll tip off that'll take away the surprise. I think that's a false claim. The only airborne major operations done by the Allies up to this point were Sicily, Italy, and D-Day. Tanks had been running forward against German positions all across France and never triggered a major airborne operation. So let's take for a moment and do one thing: shift over to a full day, followed by starting our clock for them, if you will, our 72-hour clock here at sunrise here. This gives them time to break through that defense that's being formed up over the last 7 days. And if they get bogged down a little bit, who cares? They have a whole day, not 2 to 3 hours to get to Eindhoven, but they have the whole day to get to Eindhoven. Okay, and if they get through quickly and easily, and they end up at Eindhoven around lunch, great. That means that they'll get to the Saône River before dark, right? And if they get to the Saône River before dark, that means first thing in the morning, they're going to be racing across. They might get to the Grave or the Nijmegen Bridge by dark of the next day. And then that means they're relieving Arnhem here in the morning of the 19th. The point is, the failure to give 30 Corps the full day to get going is going to come back and have massive consequences. A key factor here, look at this from the time that they're relieved here at the 64-hour mark. You have 2 night windows out of the 5 periods. You have a day period, a second day period, and a third day period. And in between, you have 2 night periods. Okay? This gives you a much higher percentage, from the time of kickoff to the time of relief, this gives you a much higher percentage of daylight hours for 30 Corps to do their job. So this is a bad plan. It's bad, period, the end. Now, with that said, guess what? That's what happens in war, and you just got to go with it. Okay? So now we're going to talk about, what actually happened, how did they do, look at some of the myths, and, wrap it up. So here I've taken the benchmark. We're back here at a 1500 kickoff for 30 Corps, and this is 19-20 hours into the operation. This is 64 hours into the operation here at Arnhem. And then here's 72 as our drop dead. Okay. Now let's look at the actual. Okay. I threw in this little 0 marker here to indicate how far they got on the first day, right? They didn't get to Eindhoven. They only got a little ways down the road. This is that 6 to 7 miles in the first day, and the condemnation of 30 Corps based upon the day 1 results. You kick off here at that time of the year. 7:30 in the evening is about when you run out of daylight. Okay, the twilight is between 7 and 8 o'clock kind of time frame. So you give them 3.5 to 4 hours to penetrate that hasty defense that's been set up. That turned out to be actually quite stiff, right? They had 7 days to get those 88 millimeter guns in place. Guess what? They did, and they dug in, and they were ready. They didn't hold up very long, but they did hold up for a little while. They held up longer than the 2 to 3 hours that was expected to get people all the way to Eindhoven, right? So they did that German defense did its job. Okay, so they arrive here and they they basically hunker down for the night. 30 Corps hunkers down for the night, well short of Nijmegen. Now, according to, I used Ryan for the timeline events so that everything would be consistent. So they arrive at nightfall at about the 7-mile mark. That's on page 356. And they link up at Eindhoven around noon the next day to page 360. And so here we are, noon the next day, and we're at our first point, right? We're not even to the first bridge. We're supposed to be at the San Bridge on our little rabbit jumping down the road here. We should have been arriving at the San Bridge right about here, and we're just getting to Eindhoven. Well, once again, according to Ryan's timeline, in the evening, they arrive basically around dark at the San Bridge. So clearly, based on our 1 mile per hour pace, at this stage of the game, so now the second day of activities, 30 Corps is still behind, right? And you could, if you stop your evaluation at this point, you would say, oh my God, 30 Corps is behind, okay? I don't think that's 11 hours. Whatever, it doesn't matter. Point is, they arrive here, and guess what? The bridge is out, okay? So they spend the night building the bridge, and we pick up here in the morning about 06:45. Now at 6:45 in the morning, they leave the San Bridge, and by 8:30, they're at the Grave Bridge, okay? They've gone 20-some miles in a couple of hours, okay? Like we said, you're going to make more progress at some point. As long as your average is 1 mile per hour, we're looking good. Now look how this unfolds. Here we were behind. 30 Corps was behind the pace at the San Bridge. They got further behind as they rebuilt the Bailey Bridge. So by the time they left the San Bridge, imagine that this is really the point where they depart the San Bridge. They are well behind the schedule. Okay, the San Bridge there. 2 hours later, they're ahead of our 1 mile per hour benchmark. They're arriving. In fact, they continue on up the road, and according to Ryan's timeline, they arrive at the suburbs of of Nijmegen at around noon. Okay, and so here we said, I think in the slide previously, Lewis had claimed that they arrived at Nijmegen at 9:30 in the morning. Ryan claims that they arrived and linked up at the suburbs around midday. But the point is, they're within spitting distance of Nijmegen Bridge by noon. Okay, so we're going to talk now about the consequences of the 82nd Airborne's decision here as far as securing the Nijmegen Bridge. The simple fact of the matter is 30 Corps had the rest of the day, and if the 82nd had seized that bridge, you can very easily imagine that they would have rolled on through, and within about an hour or so, they would have been across that. In terms of distance, they would have crossed over that bridge, and they might have reached Arnhem by the end of daylight hours on the 19th. It's pretty reasonable to think that was possible. But they didn't, and so they continued to move forward, and they advanced from the southwest, from the southern edge of the suburbs, if you will, and they got into overwatch positions. And the reason this is white is because the bridge is not yet secured. Yellow, it's secured; white, it's not secured. So they're basically sitting there looking at this bridge, both bridges, the railroad bridge and the road bridge. So they're close to being on schedule at this point. Okay, now they don't have the bridge yet, and fortunately the Germans were incompetent and didn't blow the bridge. But somewhere right in here in the afternoon evening time frame, the decision is made to make an amphibious assault, and we get into the old bringing the boats forward section of the movie where they can't get the boats forward. Okay, so now let's take a little bit of look at sort of how that unfolded. Real quick, if we get this amphibious operation done at night, and we kick off around 7 in the morning, it's only 8 miles from that point up the road. it's reasonable to expect that we're going to be able to reach Arnhem within 72 hours. Maybe not in the 64 hours, but certainly we're going to have, until 1500 to make our threshold. It's reasonable to think that if they can get across this water and secure these bridges, one of these bridges, that in the 8 hours remaining, if they do their 1 mile per hour plod up the road, they will arrive in Arnhem at right about the 72-hour mark. So there's still time, even without securing this bridge just yet, there's still time to meet their objective of 72 hours. Now let's sort of take a look at what really happened. It wasn't until about 1500 the next day that the amphibious assault goes in and the bridges are secured and the link up is effected at the town of Lent by about 1730, which is right about dusk. I think my icon's off a little because it was about dusk. And this is kind of how the movie portrays it. The idea was to make that assault, and it kept getting pushed back and kept getting pushed back and kept getting pushed back. The book is a little more precise and says it was supposed to happen at 1300. Who knows? The point is, in reality, the operation doesn't kick off till about 1500, and they don't seize and secure both bridges until just about dark. Now here's the problem. The bridge at Arnhem, Frost's men are overrun at 10 o'clock that evening. So let's give them the benefit of the doubt and say they secured it as early as about 6 o'clock in the evening. They only had about 4 hours to move down the road and only had a couple of hours of daylight. So what happens is this delay right here ends up being the second of two major delays, right? We had the first delay back in here, but all of these delays were made good. By the time we got to the Grave Bridge, we were back on schedule, actually slightly ahead of schedule. By the time we got to the suburbs of Nijmegen, we were basically ahead of schedule. We were supposed to be at Grave, and here we are already at Nijmegen. So the cost of this delay, obviously, if the delay prior to Eindhoven and the delay at the bridge, let's imagine we had gotten to Nijmegen, right here, then we would have maybe been able to relieve Arnhem. So obviously, together, the two events, the stiffer and defense and the slower progress followed by the bridge, collectively, if those had not happened, maybe everything would have shifted to the left. Maybe Arnhem would have been relieved. But the one thing that by itself causes a problem is the failure to have those bridges at Nijmegen, which leads into a second set of delays right here. Now we're going to talk about the blame game in a minute, but what happens, once you get across here, you have a very limited amount of time to go relieve them. Now, this kind of goes to my point about the 96 hours. Imagine if 30 Corps had come in and relieved them on the morning of the 21st, right here. That's well within 96 hours, okay? To think that you wouldn't want to be prepared to go beyond 72 hours, John Frost's men would have gone further if they could, right? This is not a slight on them. But conceptually, if 30 Corps had arrived on the morning of the 21st, which they didn't, but if they had arrived on the morning of the 21st, the Frost battalion would have already been overrun. It would have been too late. But did they perform unreasonably? I'm going to say I don't think so. I think that 72 hours might have been the official benchmark. But if you are relieved, and this would be much less than 96 hours, right here. There's still 8 or 10 hours here. If they'd gotten relieved here, they're still talking about 90 hours, right? At some point, you got to have some slack in the system, so to speak. The whole idea was to keep dropping troops. Remember, to keep this effort going, just in case it doesn't get done in 72 hours. Okay, so let's take a look now, real quick, at. Let's jump ahead here. Okay, let's take a look here at the actual situation there at Nijmegen and why they had the delays. Now, I took this out. I think this is out of a game somewhere. It's a crappy map. It's September 17th. Well, that's the starting day of the operation. This is now on the 19th when the amphibious assault is occurring. The reason I'm using it is because it actually has pretty well laid out graphics. It's not perfect. No, it's 2 miles to the Grave Bridge. It's actually more like 8 or 9 miles to the bridge, but depending on which route you take. But here you have the Irish Guards up in the on the heights. You have the Grenadier Guards that are kind of bogged down in street fighting a little bit here. It's not entirely clear where everybody is in terms of the Germans. This is a generalized flow of events. I'm going to show you a more precise flow here in this panel over here. And so let's take a look here at the basic scheme of it. Irish Guards put a bunch of shells over here for smoke. The airborne goes across. When about half of them make it across, this is the famous scene where Robert Redford, Major Julian Cook, makes his crossing. They go over, Hail Mary, full of grace, and they get on the other side. And after they recover and kill all the guys who are trying to shoot them here on the beach, they move up and they secure the north end of the railroad bridge. Now, this is just for. I show this in part because this portion is because it's not portrayed accurately in movies. It's generally speaking, it is badly handled in most of the narratives that I've read. You go from the amphibious assault to the road bridge, and the discussion of the railroad bridge and the time that it took, it kind of gets lost in the wash. And the reality is, the 82nd Airborne assaults the north end of the railroad bridge. Okay, this would have been an adequate bridge. It's not ideal, but it would have been adequate and clear the area. And this is the one where they have the guys in the girders and they think they're snipers and they're probably actually engineers trying to rig the bridge. But this is the famous scene in the movie. The only problem is the movie is showing the road bridge. This is the railroad bridge. And we're going to look at them in a moment, just mainly for those people who haven't had a chance to delve into it and who are kind of interested in the details. Once this bridge is secured, some of the folks from the 82nd start moving toward the road bridge. And from this point forward refers now to a group of tanks under Sergeant Robinson, the Firefly tanks, the upgun 76mm high-velocity version of the Shermans, that are released from the Grenadier Guards and directed to seize the road bridge. The commander of the Grenadiers sees the flag on the north end of the bridge and either mistakes it or whatever, he thinks the bridges have been secured. He orders Robinson to make his run. Robinson thinks it's a suicide run, and he hauls down the road. And I believe this is the path he followed based on the descriptions of a couple of different places. They talk about the roundabout. You see a roundabout here. Well, there's actually a roundabout here as well. Notice on Kershaw's book, this was done by one of the Germans after the fact, and it shows their position and their escape route that they used afterwards, which goes underneath the bridge here. And so Robinson talks about having to go around and come in from the far side, the southeast side, that this ramp here was open, and then he gets up on this ridge. Now, this is kind of important. If you look at the gradient here, it's graphically shown. The SS that are basically ground guys. These are not panzers. They belong to the Panzer Division, but they're infantry guys, right? So he makes this suicide run with his 4 tanks, goes around the roundabout or some back way, whichever. I don't know the exact path he took. He gets up onto this guy here, this up ramp here, and gets on the bridge and crosses without assistance from anyone. The 82nd Airborne was not on this bridge. They actually link up somewhere right about in here at the town of Lent. Okay, so this is kind of important when we start to evaluate 30 Corps' performance at Nijmegen. Up until now, Lewis and I agree. 30 Corps' performance is actually pretty good. Could they have done things a little differently, a little better, whatever? The bottom line is they arrived ahead of schedule, so to speak, using our 1 mile per hour benchmark. Okay? And when the time came, the amphibious assault wasn't necessary. This operation by these Fireflies was successful without any airborne support. So we're going to come back to that a little bit later. Now, real quick, just wanted to show you the bridge. This is the road bridge. So here's that. Down in here is where those infantry guys were, and this is the elevated portion. So you can see that they weren't on the bridge. They weren't secure. This bridge was open, and the question remains: how long was it open? Both the 82nd and 30 Corps failed to recon this thing adequately, because when Robinson started driving around that roundabout, there was no one to block his way. He just drove right up the ramp and across. And at any point, he thought the thing was going to blow in front of his face. Now, you remember from the movie, there's this single big arch here, right? This is the bridge that's portrayed in the movie. The reality is, and this is the long bridge. If you look here, the elevated section starts here. Remember the escape route we talked about that the Germans took? That's this road that goes underneath here. And here's the tank. Here's where the tanks would have been coming across under Robinson's command. Okay, so now let's take a look at the railroad bridge. Okay. Now the railroad bridge is a little different. You can see here a little bit later down, a few days later, the thing gets dropped. But this is the bridge that was actually secured. It's not quite as big, 500 meters, but still a major expanse. And you also, I don't know if that does include the elevated portion. You see here I did Google to go from the elevated portion to the elevated portion. So there's 1,600 meters of elevated, any section of which, if the Germans had blown it, that bridge would have been rendered useless. So either one of these bridges would have sufficed, but the road bridge was always the preferred one because it gave them a better road surface so that any form of traffic could move. Going across the railroad bridge would have restricted some of the traffic flow. Okay, so here's our timeline, right? The amphibious assault was, scheduled at 1. It got delayed. They finally get across. And, now here we are, at 10 o'clock. And the forces on the Arnhem Bridge, the British collapse. And so now we're getting, basically, we missed the gap. We get across at the 75 hour mark here. We're 3 hours behind, and 4 hours later, poof. So we're 7 hours late, and poof. Now, in fairness, remember, the idea was that the British would have more folks on the bridge, right? And they might have been able to hold out. So the presence of the 9th and 10th Panzers skews that 96. Roy had the resources that if the 9th and 10th Panzer hadn't been there, he would have been able to last 96 hours, etc. But bottom line is the troops that made it to the bridge, couldn't hold out any longer. So now we're going to deviate just momentarily into the blame game. We're not going to spend a lot of time on it, but the bottom line is if the 82nd Airborne had seized those bridges on day 1, when 30 Corps arrives right here around lunchtime, they could have blown through. They would have been across the Nijmegen Bridge, and they might have made it all the way to Arnhem on day 3, September 19th. Okay, worst case, they would have been arriving the next day, well within the time of the collapse there later in the day. So the failure to take this bridge, we can't stress enough the importance of that decision. Now, I will say, going back to the good plan badly executed, it was a bad plan badly executed. And part of the bad plan was deprioritizing the bridges. Okay, now Gavin says that he deprioritized them in favor of the Goose Peak Hikes. The 82nd Airborne failed to secure those bridges by themselves. This is, let's call this the American contribution to the failure. Okay, Browning endorsed that. Okay, so you can, you might say, well, Browning shouldn't have endorsed it. So there is a British component to this, but we're going to blame the Americans sort of up to this point, because right up until midday in this link up in the vicinity of Nijmegen, if that bridge had been secured, if either of those two bridges had been secured, Arnhem would almost certainly have been relieved. It's inconceivable that they would not have been able to relieve them. here's where we start to get the waters muddied a little bit. Remember, we talked about the fact that at a little after the amphibious assault occurred, the Grenadier Guards released Robinson and sent him and his tanks across the. Now, Robinson crosses the bridge and then he stops, and they say, okay, this is where the drink tea thing comes in. Okay, the fact of the matter is, there was no airborne assistance in this. So the question is, if Robinson had been detached an hour earlier, 2 hours earlier, 4 hours earlier, how long was that bridge exposed? How long was it accessible? Failure of reconnaissance by the 82nd, failure of reconnaissance by 30 Corps collectively is a massive, big question. What might have been? There's some other aspects, and we'll talk about logistics and refueling. Remember, they knew they were going to do the amphibious operation right in here, and then part of the defenders of 30 Corps say, well, gosh, they had to resupply after supporting the amphibious assault. The 28 hours that's spent here in preparation is an utter debacle from the 30 Corps perspective. There is absolutely no reason. The whole reason you're there is to seize the bridges and exploit it once you get across. And all you can muster is 4 tanks. We're going to talk about that in a minute. This is in this window, we start to see we have some American contribution. They didn't do proper recon on the bridge and tell the Brits to make a dash. But there's also a lot of issues for 30 Corps at this stage of the game. And then, of course, once we get across, at that point, the rest of the show is British, right? It's British tanks, it's British infantry, and it's British airborne. And so, unfortunately, they don't reach there. Now, one of the things that's, I mentioned is they talk about logistics. Okay, well, they had 28 hours to prepare the exploitation forces, and they didn't. So 30 Corps was slow off the line. All right, they had the delays, they had the bridge. Okay, this was all critical. After they got there, their progress was good. They arrived at noon. So the key thing is that by noon of the next day, all of the delays up to that point had been made good based upon our 1 mile per hour benchmark, right? They were still on or ahead of schedule in such a way that they could meet their objectives within the 72 hours. So they were doing good. We have to face the fact that the decision to deprioritize the bridges, this is the only decision that by itself could alter the outcome. Collectively, the slow start and the Son Bridge collectively might have made a difference, but by itself, if the Nijmegen Bridge had been in our hands, Arnhem would certainly have been relieved. Okay. The overlap period, there was 28 hours to stage it and execute it, and they ended up taking the bridge without any support from 82nd Airborne. When I say they didn't have any support, the Germans were withdrawing in part because there were Americans on the North Shore. So, did they help with the road bridge? Yeah, but it was indirect help. It was causing people to leave their fighting positions. They did not physically get on the bridge. Okay, and then we have the 30 Corps flat out. They failed to scout the bridges. I should have put the 82nd Airborne in this bullet right here because all 3 folks failed to scout their bridges properly. They seized the bridge without assistance. Both spearheads failed. When I say both spearheads, the one across each of these bridges, they failed to understand the concept of blitzkrieg. Imagine if Guderian and Rommel had stopped to worry about their flanks in France in 1940. Would they have ever made it to the coast? Probably not. The whole point of getting across those bridges was to get some tanks up to support and artillery up to support the folks at Arnhem. it's like at some point the Grenadier Guards they took the time to stop and detach 4 tanks on a suicide run. Why not detach the entire battalion? Just pick up and leave. Drive away from the fight and drive down the same road that he took. And instead of being on the north side with 4 tanks, you're on the north side with 16 tanks or whatever. Leave the mess behind. Okay, that's what this kind of operation does. You let 30 Corps worry about the mess that's behind. You got the tank, the gas that's in your tank, and the ammo that's plenty to get 8 miles. Go do your job. Okay. Instead, they detach 4 tanks to go do their job. So these, it's just amazing, unfortunately, that in that 28-hour window, they did not really prepare properly. Okay, real quick, we're going to go through some myths. You know, they were slow, they were deprioritized the bridges as the sole purpose. Americans undercut the operation with supplies, 4 days alone on the bridge, blah, blah, blah. Okay? Absolutely, no doubt about it. You know, 30 Corps was not slow up until this point of the game right here. Going forward, okay, so Gavin, if Gavin is to blame in the sense that if we had the bridges, 30 Corps would have kept rolling, and almost certainly Arnhem would have been relieved. But they weren't there, and then we go into the phase where, you know, it's like, okay, now we start to get into sort of shared blame. Okay, the Americans screwed up, but there was still plenty of time to redeem the situation, and collectively, the Allies did not. The myth of diverted supplies. This is horseshit, okay? There's a lot of people who try and blame the failure that, you know, Bradley and Hodges in particular diverted stuff to Patton. These are operational considerations. These are, if the operation had succeeded and Dempsey had not been able to advance over the Rhine because of a lack of supplies, then you could argue that Hodges' diversion of supplies was the issue, okay? But, you know, all 3 of the main leaders here, they know that of the importance of moving, yet the problems of supply were immense. They were short of gasoline and ammunition. You had 28 hours to prepare the tanks, the exploitation force, once you get across the bridge, and yet they weren't fueled, okay? That's inexcusable. And people will say, well, they exhausted their ammo supporting the amphibious assault. No. You load your tanks with your combat load. You have a pickup truck, an ammo truck sitting right beside each of the tanks with 20 rounds of smoke. You have one guy in the truck, you have one guy in the tank, and when it comes time to shoot the smoke, the guy in the truck hands a round over to the guy in the tank who hands it to the loader, and the gunner fires it. And you repeat that process 20 times. Meanwhile, all of your ready rack inside your tank is fully loaded with ammo. You just topped off the fuel at 2 in the afternoon, with the operation Get Ready to Start here at 3. And then as soon as it's clear that the amphibious assault is going to reach the far bank and you have to stop shooting shells anyway, you move the trucks out of the way, you fire up the tanks, and you roll like hell. You drive like hell for the bridges. Because at that point, there's nothing left to do but go for the bridges. So this business about supply problems is horseshit. This is a tactical level supply problem inside of the corridor because of a single road, so to speak, but it doesn't excuse why those exploitation forces were not ready, period.
I'm sorry, Johnny, getting stuck on that bloody bridge 4 days on your own.
Okay, I love the myths. 4 days on your own. Remember, 72 hours, right? 72 hours, 4 days, okay? The airborne guys love them to death, but they get a little bit of a free ride here. If we go back to that timeline, you'll see that anything that occurs in the first 24 hours is day 2, right? So they get a free extra day to the myth. If they had been relieved at 72 hours, the airborne guys would have gone to the bar and gotten a beer and said, yeah, they told us 2 to 3 days, and they took them 4 days. And the reality is it took them 72 hours. So there's a little bit of that hours versus days, when we start the operation, that sort of thing, that goes into the myth that makes it seem like a 30 Corps was way behind the power curve. Quick thing on whether or not, whether Robinson should have driven up the road and relieved him. Well, he was willing to do it, but the reality is, if you look at the tanks in the early part of the war, the Germans, had the advantage. Then along comes the Matilda and the Sherman in the desert phase of the war, and the Sherman is the equal of the Mark IIIs and Mark IVs, no doubt. It could handle them. Okay, well then the Russian front introduces the Panther and the Tiger to the equation, and the Sherman is a crap tank compared to these two weapon systems. Now, the 76 millimeter, the British called it Firefly. I don't remember what the Americans called it, but the high velocity gun at least made the gun comparable on the tanks that Robinson had, but the tanks was still crap compared to the two main tanks available to the 9th and 10th Panzer that were there at Arnhem. So this theory that these 4 tanks are going to run up there, there was about a 4 to 1 ratio between Panthers and Shermans in the fight. And there might have been Tigers for all we know, okay? And there were some 88 millimeters along the corridor. Who's to say there weren't some 88 millimeters, which is the main gun from the Tiger tanks. So 4 tanks, not enough. Now remember, if the Grenadier Guards had gone, 16 or 20 tanks across, yeah, then they should have gone and run up the road. But 4 tanks running up the road. Imagine you're Sergeant Robinson and you got your 4 tanks, and it's an open field fight. Okay, well, okay, you don't need quite that many because you got the upgraded guns. So maybe 3 to 1's all you need. And you get into a fight with the Panthers here in the open field. Okay, he opens up, he takes out one of them. Your gunners are real good. They spot him, they fire. Maybe the Panther gets off a second, but you're still going to win in this kind of a fight, in an open fight with the Fireflies. Okay, but this is what they were facing. Okay, and this is why just running pell-mell up the road is crazy. He's going to be in a well-defended position, camouflaged. He's going to have observers. He's going to know what's coming, and he's just going to pick them off. Okay, so this theory that 4 tanks could go down the road is crazy. Not to mention they had orders to secure the bridge because they hadn't sent enough forces across, right? The exploitation force was not good. So here we are, 30 Corps. Yeah, they were delayed. Okay, they made that good. The issue at Nijmegen is probably the major issue in my opinion. It's the only decision that by itself could have changed things. Overall progress was good up to arrival at Nijmegen, but it's at Nijmegen that you see the breakdown. Okay, when the inability to understand what the priority is, just drop what you're doing. It doesn't matter if you're engaged, if you're armor and you're engaged in a house-to-house infantry fight, just drop what you're doing and run like hell for the bridges. That's what you're there for. You're not there to fight and clean up the mess in Nijmegen. And this was just a huge mistake. Okay, in conclusion, we're running just a little longer than I want, but in conclusion, going forward, these are some of the things I'm going to talk about on the channel. I hope you found this video interesting, and maybe we looked at some things in a way you hadn't seen before or hadn't thought about. I would say like and subscribe, but this channel isn't really yet up, and I'm not really looking for making a living off of it, but like and subscribe if you will, and as new content comes along, we'll be sure to get it to you. So thank you all. Have a nice evening.